Good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here for this installment of our CMAHC webinar series. We're pretty excited. This is a cool one. So today's discussion is around surf venues, also known as surf pools, which are a novel type of facility that is really unique in its regulatory and operational challenges. We're very happy to have two guest speakers today. Michele Hlavsa is with the CDC, and she's been chairing the Surf Venues Committee that has been drafting guidance from a CDC standpoint for these type venues. And we're also happy to have Tom Lochtefeld, who is with Surf Loch, and he's one of our committee members for that same committee, as well as really just an expert guy in all things surf venues. These are really, really cool type facilities, I have to add. It's been a pleasure, but very interesting to be part of this process. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and we'll get started. We'll start off with Michele Hlavsa, if she can go ahead and share her screen. One comment on questions. We're anticipating the presentation will take about 30 to 40 minutes. If you have any questions, please load them into the chat box. When we're through with the presentation, then we will start going through the questions in order as they come in chat. But again, please load any questions in the chat box. As a reminder, if you're not presenting, please keep your screens and your computers on mute so we don't have a whole lot of chatter going on. With that being said, Michele, take it away.
You guys aren't seeing the right screen, are you?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, hold on. Let me disconnect and get this settled. CDC computers are not working well today. All right. Can you see the right screen now? Let's just minimize this. You guys see my screen?
Yes. Thanks, Michele.
Awesome. Sorry about that. All right. Let's just start from the beginning. Okay, so some background on surf venues. Surf venues are basically large format aquatic venues. This is going to dwarf any other aquatic venue we've seen before. We're talking about a quarter acre to multiple acres in surface area. And surf venues are going to be dedicated to surfing on a surfboard or other similar surfing or wave riding device. They're going to have a floor and equipment that is going to generate traveling waves and surfable waves. We have had wave pools, but those are more like swells. You can't really surf them. You can float them, but you can't surf them. But these waves that we see in surf venues are going to mimic what we see in the ocean. Surf venues are also meant to be only used by surfers. There are going to be no bathers in surf venues. Other definitions that we need to keep in mind is what is a surfer? A surfer is a person who goes into a surf venue, has contact with the water, either through spray or partial or total immersion, depending upon how good of a surfer they are. Surfers are going to be on a board or other similar surfing or wave riding device. And they're potentially going to be exposed to contaminated water, or they're going to potentially contaminate the water. In terms of bathymetry, here we're talking about a pretty critical component of surf venues. So the bathymetry refers to the shape or the slope of the floor of the surf venue. And this is what's going to help generate the traveling surfable waves, the desired waves. There's also pre-operational surfing. So this surfing is done before the surf venue is open to the public. So basically, this is where you test out the facility. You have it designed, you have it constructed, you got the water in. Before you open to the public, you're going to fine tune how the waves are being generated. And this basically allows the designer and the builder to test the surf venue with surfers, fine-tune the waves, etc., before it is open to the public. All right, so what we're going to talk about right now are preliminary interim guidance for surf venues. Right now, the Model Aquatic Health Code, which is CDC guidance, doesn't address surf venues. Now, we all know that the Model Aquatic Health Code is all about preventing illness, injury, disability, and death, and that's really how we looked at the perspective we use to look at surf venues. Surf venues, because they have this bathymetry, because we're talking about generating waves, because we're not talking about bathers, but and surfers instead. The risks associated with surf venues, whether they be health or safety risks, injury risk, or illness risks, they are going to be inherently different than what we see in other aquatic venues. The Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code, or CMAHC, set up an ad hoc surf venue committee. We did this before CRs were due for the current MAC. We weren't able to finish it on time, so we took another stab at it and set up another committee. The Surf Venue Committee is made up of surf venue designers, builders, owners, and state and local public health officials, and we all shared our expertise to try to develop this guidance, which is basically going to become a CR. The guidance is preliminary. We haven't finalized it yet. I think the CR is actually going to come out possibly before this. It is interim, meaning that if for some reason the CR doesn't pass or whatever may happen, we would post something on the website, and that would be interim CDC guidance until we can actually get surf venue guidance into the MAC. And the guidance that we come up with is considered supplementary to what the MAC says. So we're not going to go line by line and say, the walls need to be this way and this has to happen. This is just meant to say, this is where the surf venues are exempted, and this is where we're changing things around a bit. So in terms of this guidance, I want to get to design and construction first. So here we're going to depend a bit on computational fluid dynamics models, or CFD models. And what we're saying is we're going to require CFD models to come in with a design report. And basically the rationale there is to make sure that all dead zones have been eliminated. Ideally, surf venues are going to be designed, constructed, operated, and managed in a way that there are no dead zones. But this is a huge, we're talking millions of gallons when we're talking about this aquatic venue. So we want to make sure that we've addressed dead zones, and one way might be through generating waves. There also, and I heard this from the designers and the owners, there's potentially quite a bit of intellectual property associated with these surf venues. And we want to make sure that, we don't jeopardize anybody's intellectual property and anyone's investment in research in pushing aquatics forward. So the guidance also calls for setting up an alternative mechanism for submitting surf venue plans or drawings to the authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ, and to do this in a way that prevents the release of intellectual properties. We don't want a records request to accidentally release, what proprietary information, what someone or some organization has invested a lot of money into developing. All right, next slide, chemical storage spaces. There's nothing really new here, but we're highlighting chemical storage spaces because of the quantity of chemicals that we're going to need. We're going to need a lot of disinfectant on site. We're going to need a lot of pH adjusting chemicals on site, and as well as additional chemicals. So we need to acknowledge the fact that, yes, chemical storage spaces, they need to be set the way the MAC calls for, but there might be additional requirements or additional approvals needed. We might need to go through a fire department now, or, a hazmats might need to approve this as opposed to what you'd have to go through for getting a storage space for your typical traditional rectangular pool. We're going to move away from theoretical peak occupancy and go to peak surfer occupancy. Basically, this is calculating the surface area being divided, the surface area, excuse me, the water surface area accessible to surfers divided by a density factor. And the density factor we've chosen is 1,000 feet squared of water surface area accessible to the surfer. And the thinking here is that surfers are going to require more surface area in a shorter period of time. And if they're going to surf into each other, you know, they're going to potentially injure each other. The density factor for surf venues can go up. It cannot come down. It cannot be below the 1,000 feet. This is sometimes an order of three orders of magnitude, excuse me, greater than the density factors for other aquatic venues. Other aquatic venues we see anywhere from 10 to 20 feet squared per bather. But again, these surfers are going to cover a lot more surface area in a shorter period of time, and we want to prevent injuries. In terms of the wave break zone, the wave break zones for surf venues are going to be exempt from the slip resistant finish that the MAHC currently requires at less than 3 feet water depth. And that's because we don't want surfers falling in this area and hitting and sliding on the floor. The slip resistant finish is going to increase the risk and severity of injuries, not only skin injuries, but other injuries. The exception to this would be areas where the surfers are accessing or egressing from the wave break zone. In terms of turbidity, we're going to move to measuring turbidity objectively and continuously. We're going to go to turbidity meters. So the thinking here is there is going to be a big issue with environmental contamination. I'm not as worried about 40 surfers contaminating the water. I'm more worried about the environmental contamination coming in, the leaves, the dirt. I mean, when you're talking about the surface area there's going to be a lot of that. And the other issue being, we're not going to be able to check for water clarity from the deck the way we can for a pool. So we want something objective. We want something that's continuously looking at the turbidity of the water, and we're going to be using turbidity meters. The bottom slope and draining requirements of the MAHC. Currently, when you drain a pool, the MAHC says that you shouldn't be leaving any puddles. There shouldn't be any trapped standing water. And that becomes a problem with a surf venue when you have bathymetry. You're shaping and sloping so that you can create these waves. So what the committee is saying now is that the bottom slope, except in areas designated for access and egress, are going to be exempt from the bottom slope requirements as well as the draining requirements. And this is because again, the draining is not an issue, but I'm going to address the draining issue later under operation and management. In terms of trench drains, again, surf venues are going to be exempt from the trench drain recommendations in the zero depth zone if the recirculation otherwise demonstrates sufficient surface skimming. And this is going to be because at some point, some designers have said that, you know, trench drains might not be feasible. They're going to be looking to quell the waves on the beach area. So just to address that, as long as the surface skimming is being taken care of, then we can exempt surf venues from trench drains. Protrusions and extensions. Well, the MAHC also calls for you know, not having protrusions or extensions, and that's exactly what the bathymetry is basically going to be. And again, we need the bathymetry or the shape or the slope of the floor to make sure we're generating the waves we want are being generated. But we're still calling for the design of the bathymetry not to lead to entanglement or not to interfere with the operation of the surf venue. So there's another exemption for surf venues. In terms of depth markers and no diving markers, we are asking, or the direction here is to provide a marker with surf venues range of depth instead of depth markers, and a no diving marker at controlled access points. Surf venues will have controlled access. So at that point, the surfers and the staff will read what the depth of the range of the surf venues is, and that they shouldn't be diving. Otherwise, these markers are going to have to conform or comply with the MAHC recommendations. And this is because the water depth at any given spot in the surf venue can change substantially with traveling waves. And if we're saying that the water is deeper than it actually is at a given point of time, injuries can occur. In terms of lighting, it is really hard to say we're going to stick by the surface lighting requirements and the underwater lighting requirements that the MAHC has currently. And the issue here is the fact that the water depth is changing, and the water depth can range. Even if the water's still, the water depth can range quite substantially. And what we're really aiming for is to be able to see a person on the bottom of the floor within 30 feet of wherever you are on the water surface, or sorry, so if I'm at the water surface within 30 feet, I should be able to see someone on the floor, and that's the goal. The committee discussed this greatly, and we actually set minimum pre-operational guidance for where the lighting should be. It should be 4 to 8 horizontal foot candles for shallow, 6 to 8 for medium depth, and for deep water, 10 to 12 horizontal foot candles. And that's just beginning. That's just when we're at the pre-operational surfing. So this is before we're opening to the public. So there are surfers and we're trying to fine tune the waves. And at that point, this is kind of where our minimum range is going to sit. And the problem that has come up with surf venues is on the shallow end of surf venues, the venue has this white light pastel finish. We're getting glare at or our operators are seeing glare when the water is shallow and the basin is so white. So we're probably going to have to go to a lower level of lighting than we would see for our traditional aquatic venues. And the water depth changes. So we're going to have to make sure that, when the water's still and maybe it's 3 foot deep, you need a certain lighting. But when the water is deeper, we're going to have to go to a higher level of when the waves are being generated, we might need a higher level of lighting. So this all needs to be worked out in the pre-operational surfing. And you can also guess that when we're talking about surf venues, we're talking about a lot of different designs. We're talking about generating waves and using different methodologies, and one set recommendation isn't going to work. But the ultimate goal is to be, if I'm at the water surface, I can see someone on the floor within 30 feet. And again, that's why on this slide here, we talked about ranges at the pre-operational level. In terms of turnover and flow rate, I think this is where we start seeing surf venues push aquatics forward and push us toward performance-based operations. So here we talked about, the maximum turnover rates of a half an hour or of 6 hours. That's just not going to work for surf venues. But what we really want to make sure is the turbidity is where it needs to be, the disinfection concentration is where it needs to be, and the pH of the water is where it needs to be. So right now we're turning more toward performance-based. This is why we talked about the turbidity meters constantly being assessing the turbidity. We're constantly checking the concentration of the disinfection and the pH. So we're going to performance-based measures here. In terms of the perimeter deck, this should not be surprising. We're not asking for a perimeter deck around 100% of the surf venue. We don't do this for wave pools. Basically, what we're saying is a perimeter deck needs to be provided where surfers, where aquatic staff access or egress from the surf venue. Controlled access points. This is not much different than a lazy river. Surf venues will have controlled access points. And here we're going to talk about, you know, at the controlled access point, we're going to provide a minimum of 1 drinking water fountain, a unisex bathroom, a 1 hand washing station, and a rinse shower. The thinking here being it's going to be within 300 feet like it is with the MAC if children less than 5 are not to be using the surf venue. But if children are going to be using the surf venue, then we need to go down to the 200 feet distance, walking distance. And that's, again, consistent with the MAC. In terms of emergency shutoff switches, this, again, is not that different from wave pools. We want to disable the wave action if we need to go in for a distressed aquatic staff member or a surfer. There'll be 2 emergency shutoff switches. They'll be clearly labeled, just like the MAC calls for consistently for other aquatic venues. One will be placed, you know, where there's a lifeguard. That could be a lifeguard tower or stand, and the secondary one will secondary switch or switches if the surf venue wants to use more than 2. Then to maximize the effectiveness of the safety plan, that's what's going to dictate where the secondary switches are located. And again, this is consistent with what we have in the MAC for wave pools. In terms of operation and management, I talked a bit about pre-operational inspections. There's going to be one where pre-operational surfing is not going to be allowed until the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, does an inspection that demonstrates that the facility, including the surf venue, is in compliance with requirements. And opening the surf venue to the public will be prohibited until adjustments to the surf venue, fine-tuning the waves, etc., the lighting has been finalized, and then the AHJ can come again and do a secondary pre-operational inspection, and that is before the venue is allowed to open to the public. In terms of draining the surf venue, we talked about this earlier. We want to make sure we're not creating a place where you know, unauthorized entry leads to drowning, or where we're breeding mosquitoes. So here we're going to want to prevent puddling of water or trapping of standing water. And basically what we came to as a committee is we don't want to alter the bathymetry, and the bathymetry can lead to the puddling of the water, the trapping of standing water. So if we're talking about a temporarily draining the surf venue, then we can take temporary measures. We can have a sump pump. We can take steps like that. If we're talking about more permanently draining the surf venue, then we talk about you know, altering the surf venue floor, altering the bathymetry. In terms of wave frequency, if the CFD model shows that generating waves is required to eliminate dead zones, then the wave frequency cannot be lower than the wave frequency in the CFD model. In terms of turbidity, here we're saying that the turbidity needs to be maintained at less than 5 NTUs, or nephelometric, turbidity units, and this has to be continuous. We need to be able to see surfers or any person on the bottom of the surf venue, and we want to make sure we ensure disinfectant effectiveness. So this is based on drinking water standards from the World Health Organization. And for drinking water, if we are in a resource poor jurisdiction, then the NTUs can go a little bit higher, but need to be maintained less than 5 NTUs, and that is to make sure that we are allowing disinfection to work. In terms of disinfection, surf venues will need to maintain a minimum of 1 part per million or milligrams per liter disinfection at a minimum. The AHJ may consider dropping that to 0.5 when waves are not generated. If the criteria, if multiple criteria are met. One, I've kind of already said it, only when waves are being generated. Two, everything that is recommended that the surf venue complies with. So we have established and we're implementing a biofilm plan. We're doing our best to reduce environmental contamination. For example, landscaping around the surf venue. You want to minimize the dust getting in there. We're using filtration that goes beyond traditional filtration. Additional requirements for dropping to 0.5 will be using secondary treatment, the UV, the ozone, increasing the frequency of water quality testing, increasing the frequency of inspections. So water quality testing, instead of every 4 hours, goes down to 2 hours. If we do drop to 0.5, we also cannot use cyanuric acid. And I guess this last bullet point or sub-bullet point where I'm talking about prohibited organic material finish, that is clearly said in the MAC, and that is reiterated in our guidance for surf venues, because we know that there was one case of Naegleria associated with a surf venue, and they used sand to create a beach-like look for the surf venue. In terms of the liner, part of daily inspections and part of operating a surf venue will be to monitor the lining integrity. We want to make sure that it's not torn and doesn't present a risk for entrapment. So the wave forces can move the liner, and if there is groundwater below the liner, that can make the wave forces more likely to tear the liner. In terms of management, a qualified operator is going to have to meet the MAC qualified operating standards. They're going to successfully have to complete a course. They're also going to have to complete training on the following courses: chemical safety laws and practices, and this is going to be specific to surf venues in terms of the quantity of chemicals being stored. Are there additional approvals needed? Is there additional safety equipment or personal protective equipment that's needed? The surf venue operator will also need to be trained on the wave generating and wave quelling equipment and features. This is probably going to be pretty specific to each surf venue, but if the owners are going to spend a lot of money on paying for the design and construction of these venues and the equipment, we want to make sure that the operators know how to use the equipment, how to use the features that generate and quell the waves, and any other equipment that's going to be used. There have been different approaches to filtration, kind of using robots and skimming the surface kind of with nets. And so whatever approaches are taken, any additional equipment the operator needs to be trained on. And at least one qualified operator needs to be on site when the surf venue is open for surfing. Qualified lifeguards. So qualified lifeguards are going to need to complete training or meet the standards or meet MAC qualifications, or they're going to need to complete a certified open water lifeguard course. Regardless of which course that they complete, they will also need to complete on-site training. These surf venues are so big, they have their own currents within them. And this is how open water lifeguard training courses are set up. You do standardized training overall, and then you go to your specific venue and do training for that specific venue. In terms of chemical release response, again, this is no different than what the MAC currently says, but we address it in surf venue guidance. Just to say, we're dealing with a substantial amount of chemicals on site, and therefore, the rules might be different, and we want to make sure we have all the approvals, all the safety equipment we need. In terms of water sample collection and water quality testing plan, the collection points are going to have to be established so that they provide a representative snapshot of the water quality throughout the venue. This isn't going to be waterside testing at one spot. And it's going to have to be developed in the sense of it might involve setting GPS coordinates to make sure we know we're testing at the correct spot. I mean, we're talking about a 1/4 acre to multiple acres when we're talking about surface venues of surface area of surf venues, excuse me. The procedures for water collection are going to have to be followed and outlined well in the plan. And as always, you're going to have to train your staff on the procedures, update them accordingly. In terms of fecal and vomit contamination response, when we're talking about, a fecal or vomit issue or vomit contamination in the water, we're going to remove the contamination. If the and it ends there. If we have an outbreak that's associated with Giardia or a pathogen that has a contact inactivation value less than or equal to Giardia, then we're going to shut the pool and we're going to follow the formed stool vomit decontamination recommendations after. We're going to follow that and then open up afterwards, excuse me. In terms of if we have a cryptosporidiosis outbreak associated with the surf venue, at that point, what we're going to do is we're going to follow the diarrheal stool decontamination recommendations. And this is why we called for no more than 15 parts per million in surf venues. This is to allow hyperchlorination if we need to. It is going to be really burdensome to drain a surf venue to get the cyanuric acid down so that we can hyperchlorinate. The committee still needs to address access and egress. How do we have stairs, handrails, grab rails, recessed steps, and ladders in these surf venues? Is my understanding there's been some requirements of them. We want to make sure that we can access and egress surf venues. We can do so safely and provide access, ADA access, at least at one point in surf venues, but we don't want to be causing entrapment or injury issues. We also still need to address handholds and underwater lighting. And, this work reflects a lot of graciousness and patience from committee members who have way more experience with surf venues than I do, as well as, a big thank you to Dewey Case for helping us with this committee. But I do want to make sure that, Tom and others on the committee are acknowledged, and I really appreciate them being patient with me as I learn more about surf venues and we all work together to addressing the design, construction, operation, and management of these venues. And that's it for me. Tom?
Great. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks.
Before we go dive into Q&A, I want to ask a question of Tom, right? Because I have this question as we go through and look at things. Tom, can you just kind of briefly discuss the difference between surf venues and then the rides like the Wave Rider and Epic Surf type systems? How are these surf venues different from those?
What we're creating in the surf venue is a progressively breaking wave as opposed to a stationary wave. So in a stationary wave, you have they technically call it a supercritical flow of water. And this is like in the Flow Rider or Epic Surf, for example. And that supercritical flow flows over a given form or has an interaction with deeper water, usually, or shallower water, just depending on the relationship and the formation of that, call it actual breaking wave that causes a hydraulic jump. Or it just goes over the crest and into a grading or down into call it a lake or another body of water. So those stationary waves, you have a high velocity stream of water and you're surfing on that and using gravity as the downward force and water as the pressure that allows the maneuvering relative to gravity. So in a progressive wave, what happens is the water itself is still, and energy is input either through, for example, on some of the current venues that are out there, you either have a moving sled, like is what's at Kelly Slater Waveco, or you have an impulse that's either generated by a paddle, which is what Wavegarden uses, or pneumatic technology, which basically air pressure, which is Surf Loch and Endless Surf and American Wave Machines. So those are, and then there's another system that's from Australia that uses as a plunger, which is basically moving a huge device up and down to generate waves that radiate out in a circle. But all of the phenomena that we're dealing with in surf pools, it distills down to one, call it focus of physics, and that's, you have a still body of water and you're creating a disturbance that propagates, and that energy form that propagates, as opposed to what happens in stationary waves, it's an oscillatory motion of the water molecule. So the water molecule is not moving in a stream flow, which happens in stationary waves and moving, from point A to point B. In a progressive wave, it's going in a circle. So that is, call it the physics difference. What happens from a rider perspective is that interaction with the board and the water is more gravitational, and how you're, there are currents, especially when you get into shallow flows of water and reef flows and heavy wave phenomena. And that's where the water actually gets, because it's almost like stubbing its toe on the reef when the wave comes in. So the water is trying to fill back in. So you do get currents. And likewise, when due to the asymmetrical nature of a progressive wave, when it breaks over a reef, and you're breaking from left to right or right to left, because a surfer wants that, let's call it a peel angle to the break that allows them to move on the face of the wave, as opposed to a wave that just closes it out, where it just goes across the entire wave front and just turns to whitewater. A surfer doesn't want that. They want to be riding on that unbroken face of the wave, and yet at the same token, they want to have the curl. They want, because that's where the energy is. So what you're doing then is you're negotiating, a surfer negotiates their skill set relative to trying to focus on that curl and being close to where the energy point is, the highest intensity of the wave, versus maneuvering out onto the shoulder, carving back, and then that wave progresses into shore. So I hope that gave you an explanation. I could show you pictures if that helps, but I'm sure you guys have seen plenty of waves breaking. So
no, thank you for that. Tom, we're going to throw a couple more questions your way. These are about water sourcing, right? So I'll break this up into a couple of separate questions. Typically for these facilities, where do they get their water from? Because this is not 100,000 gallons, obviously. And then do you have, what are the common challenges with filling that much water with the initial fill? Yeah,
it's a big issue. A lot of as I'll give you the examples I'm working with. The project that we built in the East Coast in Connecticut, that one used for reservoir water, and then they had to treat it, filter it, and go. The one we have in Palm Springs is basically city water. It was an old water park, and so we just used city water. That pool's about 1.4 acres in terms of surface area, and about 3 million gallons. We have another facility in Rotterdam that's a canal, and it's just canal water, but they're still going to filter it, and they're not sanitizing it though. It's just filtration, but the water's continually changing, and they filter it. So those are the well water is what they used up at Kelly Slater Waveco in huge volumes of well. So to your point, Dewey, that starting, call it chemical makeup of that water is so critical, because that then defines how you're going to be able to sanitize and, you know, the filtration process. So it's a very significant element that we have to deal with every single time.
Yeah, no, that's definitely challenging. Just kind of along those same lines, talking about evaporative losses. Just a general idea, how much water is needed daily for the makeup water? And does that pose any additional challenges to the facility?
Yeah, what we've experienced is, I'm just going to put it across the broad spectrum, that from I like to look at it from an annual basis. If it takes 5 million gallons to fill up the pool, then you're going to probably spend 5 million gallons a year in makeup water. So your makeup water, you know, as a rule of thumb, is going to be equal to the volume of the pool. You know, of course, depending on where you're located, rain, etc. But that's a good rule of thumb.
Thank you for that. Michele, I'm going to toss this question over to you. So, because it's a larger question about involving biofilm and probably less about just specific surf venues. What's the status of using chlorine dioxide as a treatment for biofilm in the U.S.?
Oh, Dewey, that's a question for the EPA. I think that's one we started historically with the EPA and we haven't quite finished. But I mean, I do see other members of our surf venue, not that I want to pull them into this question, I won't put them on the spot like this, but I do see other surf venue committee members on, so I don't know if Darren or others want to weigh in as well. Not specifically on this question, but if I know, you know, Tom's had a chance to talk and share his experience, but maybe they would like to add about their experience. Okay, maybe not.
Yeah, no,
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
Chlorine
Yeah,
dioxide
Michele.
is just kind of an interesting thing. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Dewey. I didn't mean to cut you off. This is Darren. Michele, sorry, I was taking a while to get off mute there. And I'll just chime in just briefly to say that we haven't seen chlorine dioxide applied on any of the surf venue facilities or developments that we've been involved in at this time. I think there's some merit there to, you know, to studying that as a potential benefit. But it, you know, it's not something that has been reviewed with you know, local authorities or even the EPA, to my knowledge, as it relates to these venues.
I know other industry professionals have concerns over the safety of use from chlorine dioxide, and concerns about relatively low trained operators trying to use this in their HOA pools and that type of facility. So it's definitely an interesting discussion to have. Definitely. Kicking this back over to Michele, you know, to Michele or Tom, right? What's the has there been any discussion about water temperature? So the specific question is, our comment is, wetsuit culture is prevalent that allows for surfing in cold water, but the water can also get hot, especially in the Middle East. So has been any sort of guidance on water temp in surf venues?
So we did discuss it really briefly in one of our calls, and I will say, you know, I mean, if we are worried about Naegleria fowleri, colder water temperatures are great. However, we cannot tell you scientifically where the cutoff is to say at this temperature you're safe from Naegleria and at this water temperature you're not safe.
And this is Darren again. I mean, at this point, the committee's viewing water temperature more as an operational consideration than something that is going to be, you know, something that we're going to attempt to control at these facilities, just because of the sheer volume of the water in the surface area. You know, it's typically it'd be a major energy consumption factor, or be very inefficient, we'll say, to try to heat or cool this volume of water. Each venue is going to be different, and there may be some, dependent on size, water volume, location, climate, et cetera, where that may be a valid consideration. But in most cases, you know, it's not going to be justified to try to heat or cool this type of venue. So from an operational perspective, it's understanding what the water temperature is, how it's going to be affected by solar exposure, et cetera. And if there is a possibility, especially with certain locations where water temperature is going to rise beyond the point where, you know, we feel it's safe or health, or the operator feels it's safe or healthy, or if there are parameters that need to be changed in terms of how the water treatment is approached based on water temperature, then that would be handled from, you know, as an operational consideration, a part of the, we'll call it, I guess, safety plan for these facilities.
The other point, and this was through our experience in Palm Springs, where it gets quite hot, the wave action does aerate the water, which induces, you know, additional evaporation due to the extended expansion exposure and in terms of air surface to water volume due to the aeration. So we have it has kept the water temperature comfortable. You know, it did not get overly hot. I think, you know, specifically we were at about an 84 max.
No, that's a really good point. The waves are essentially aerating the water.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. We're going to come back and talk about lifeguarding in just a minute. That's a very, very interesting topic in relation to surf pools. But kind of a little bit basic question, right? More interesting question maybe, is can these waves be set for different skill levels?
Yes, absolutely. I think all the systems out there have ability to upsize, downsize their waveform. And likewise, as a function of that, it can change it from let's call it a more hollow wave, which is more critical and more difficult, versus a beginner style wave. And also in our pools, we make two separate zones that allow us to have a second break where the primary wave, the advanced wave, actually reforms and then goes into an internal second break and breaks again. And that reef is shaped differently to allow much more forgiving, softer wave.
Thank you. So kind of shifting the discussion back over to lifeguarding and bather supervision. This is definitely an interesting aspect to discuss. Tom, you know, can you just kind of talk about how this is typically done in surf venues as far as lifeguarding and different approaches?
Yeah, the real, due to the wave action and the high currents that can form, depending on the particular pool, the frequency of the waves, you have these zones, and also because where the takeoff points are usually fixed, the areas of risk where the surfer is most likely to fall is fairly defined. So in that regard, we can locate lifeguards and have their positioning, and we call it it's almost like a floating guard who's out in the pool, that actually is there to be able to react quickly. And likewise, we have the ability in terms of we're finding that rescue boards are the best vehicle when you get some type of injury. Let's say, for example, a board hit a surfer, they get knocked out, they're down in the water. The rescue board is clearly the best vehicle for the lifeguards to come in and quickly, if they paddle out, they can get there within the short period of time, usually less than the 20 seconds, and properly position the surfer on the board, paddle over to. We actually created this situation where we can create a door that allows a surfer and the lifeguard, where the lifeguard will paddle the board up, and then there's another lifeguard to be able to facilitate and take over on the rescue. So we're definitely addressing these unique situations, which are totally different than a conventional pool. So it's very important that one recognize that the system for lifeguarding is definitely going to change.
Yeah, and also another consideration is just the physical skill required from a swimming ability to navigate these waves and is going to be significantly different from the typical pool lifeguard as well.
That's correct.
Yeah, very much so. So just a curious question, right? So Michele mentioned earlier about having emergency shutoff switches to stop the wave function. With these venues, right? How long on average, if you hit the emergency stop, how long would it take for these waves to kind of flatten out and dissipate?
The wave action, you can almost instantly stop the wave generator from making another wave. However, the issue you have is because it's a progressive wave, that wave is traveling down the pool. So you might, in one of the larger pools, have two or three waves still traveling down the pool. So if the injury occurred in call it the shallow water and towards the beach, well, it might be, and those waves are being generated, I'm going to just throw out every 10 seconds. Well, it could be, two waves might have to pass through before there's calm water. So that's 20-second intervals. So those are the features why these lifeguarding requires definite capability to negotiate and act and understand how to deal with real ongoing wave action, at least for, a 20-second window.
Right, thank you. Couple more questions. One is, what's the water depth on these things, right? What's the average depth and how deep do they typically go?
It depends on the actual wave generator. And some of the systems out there, for example, the surf lakes, they have a very deep water wave generator, which is almost like 30 feet deep. But of course, to make the wave break, that's going to significantly decrease and have a shallow reef. And all the pools you could think of wave height breaking in the ideal world, in the way that we try to design, as your breaker height equals the water depth. So however, depending on the physics of how the wave is created, and there's different physics that the different manufacturers use, that some of those waves, they break in much shallower water in order to get a hollow wave. So it's defining the character of that wave that defines the depth of the water that it breaks in. And I know that those are some of the issues that the industry is dealing with right now.
Right, thank you. So we have just a few minutes left. If you have any more questions, please post those in the chat, and we'll pass that off to our panelists. Again, as we just wait for any additional questions to come in, we'll give a minute or so. I'm just really impressed personally by the engineering that goes into these venues. It's really, I don't want to be over dramatic, but it really is a spectacle of engineering and how complex these are. Everything from how the waves are generated and those systems to the bathymetry at the bottom of the pools. They are really it's really an awesome sight to see.
Yeah, and Dewey, on that point, I think this gets back to where Michele was defining in terms of a performance-based monitoring. Because these pools are, there's, minimum pool is probably in the $10 million and up, up to 20, 30, 50 million on the big pools. The data, the amount of equipment and mechanics and sensors and it's like it's significant computer power that's already present. So we have the ability to monitor pretty much every single aspect of the pool. So there's no reason why, from a safety and an engineering perspective, we can't use performance-based and built that into the system and make that as part of the equation to make sure we have safety as a result of knowing the data to be able to deliver at any time, any one time, and have it recorded as well.
Couple of additional questions that just came in. One is for Darren, Tom, whoever wants to answer this. How many surf venues are currently in operation globally? Do we have an idea?
I think there's probably 6, 7, 8 now. And I know this year there's another 4 or 5 opening. And 2025, there'll probably be 25, 30 opening.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. So 2 last questions. One is from a public health standpoint, how willing are the manufacturers to help? And I'm shifting the question a little bit from the original posting, right? But how willing in general are manufacturers to help with public health officials doing the engineering and plan review for these things?
So do we, like any other venue, we're requiring detailed and scale drawings, and the AHJ needs as much information as possible to make a decision on whether or not to approve a surf venue. But on the other hand, as I said earlier, I think pretty early on in the talk, we're asking the AHJ to protect intellectual property, so that, like, should it come up, like a I don't know, a request for open records or whatever come up, that this intellectual property isn't sent along.
Yeah, that's going to be very, very key there.
There's a balance, right? You want to protect intellectual property, but you want to give the AHJ as much information as possible to make the best decision it can.
So I'll have the last question, and it is totally, absolutely not a serious question. And I'll throw this out to Darren or Tom, whichever one wants to answer. What's the biggest way that y'all have seen a surf venue produce, either during operation or during the kind of let's see what this thing will do phase of the commissioning process?
Yeah, I know in Palm Springs we did one that was a good 8 foot. It was a good one. We definitely had some fun with that.
I'm just having to wrap my head around that. An 8-foot wave in a man-made pool. That is insane. That was a sight to see, I bet. Yeah. Well, we're at the top of the hour. We have no more questions that have been submitted to chats. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up. I want to give a huge thank you to our panelists for taking their time out today and putting this together. And as always, giving a thanks to our volunteers from the industry and public health aspect that not only helps us with our day-to-day operations and everything involving MAC and CMAHC related activities, but specifically for this particular committee. This was a heavy lift, and a lot of work and a lot of hours went into this, going back many, many years, going back at least 3 to 4 years. So I want to thank everyone, for their continued work and for their input and their expertise. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out today to come and hear and listening to this presentation and being willing and open-minded to learn more about these new and novel venues. And we look forward to seeing all of you in the future, either at the various trade shows or on our next webinar that will be coming out. And if you are hitting the trade show circuit, please come see us at World Water Park We will have a booth there. We're excited to say. So please come by, speak, say hello, grab a business card, shake our hand, and just make sure you introduce yourself and have some conversations with us. We would love to see you. So with that being said, we're going to close it out. Thank you, everyone. And y'all have a great weekend, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.